With another set of preseason games in the books, we moved one step closer to nailing down depth charts across the league. And a few fantasy darlings got some rude awakenings. We break it all down here on the Fantasy First Down. Can you believe it? The NFL season is less than 3 weeks away, and it's very much draft season. So it's time to nail down those depth charts and work out who you want in your fantasy teams this season. If you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and my website with all my rankings on it is ffdfantasyfootball.com. I have, of course, updated my rankings after the weekend's games, and you'll find out why, because there have been a heap of movements. You can also check out my articles over at football.rasball.com. But today, we're talking about preseason games, and it's going to look a little bit like this. Let me show you what to expect. So we're going to talk about each game. I've put the depth chart up there. I'm not going to talk about every aspect of it because some of it's pretty obvious. Basically, the numbers for the quarterbacks, it's completions, then yards, then touchdowns and interceptions. For the running backs, it's obviously rushes, rushing yards, touchdowns. If they also had some receiving yards, that goes after that. For the receivers, receptions, receiving yards, touchdowns. Obviously, some players, it's unclear whether they're injured or rested. So I put my best guess in there so we can at least work out what's going on. We started off with the early game, which was the Patriots against the Eagles. Nothing particularly major jumping out here. The biggest thing for me that I think is worthwhile mentioning, and something I should shout out, by the way, I did use Nathan Yanke's kind of information a little bit in getting the snap count. So thank you to PFF for that. Plus a couple of other sites around the place to get depth charts and things like that. Our Lads is my favorite for depth charts. So make sure you go and check them out if you want extra information on that stuff. So Demario Douglas, once again, only being used in 11 personnel with KJ Osborne starting and Jalen Polk still in behind him. So I think it's getting to the point where it's really hard to be drafting Jalen Polk, expecting him to be a starter. I still think there is some upside, and I expect him to take over the starting role sooner rather than later. But the biggest concern at the moment is he's not only playing behind KJ Osborne and Kendrick Bourne, who's still injured, he's also playing behind Tyquan Thornton. So unless we see something crazy happen in the last week of games, I feel like you just can't roster Jalen Polk in redraft. He's someone that's still very interesting in Dynasty. He's still ultimately going to be their number one receiver, but he's not quite there yet. I also think Javon Baker is someone that you just can't use at all in redraft at the moment. He's someone that you really should have been questioning earlier when you were taking him in Dynasty. I was never buying into the Javon Baker hype. Also worth being a little bit wary of Kendrick Bourne. He's still not back even practicing. We're getting very close to the season. So it could be that we start off with KJ Osborne on one wing, Tyquan Thornton on the other, and Demario Douglas only playing in 11 personnel. That's just going to be ugly for the Patriots in general. That means Jacoby Brissett is totally unusable as well. Even in Superflex, Drake May is obviously looking over his shoulder the whole time. So the whole situation's very ugly. Realistically, the only players you want from the Patriots team are Hunter Henry, who's currently a little bit injured, but realistically, he's still going to have a solid role. Ramondre Stevenson, who's going to be the clear starting running back, and Antonio Gibson, who's essentially going to be his handcuff, because I do think if Stevenson goes down, we see a whole heap of Gibson. Meanwhile, for the Eagles, they rested a whole lot of starters. The thing that jumped out last week was that Johnny Wilson had worked his way up to fourth in the depth chart. And realistically, Paris Campbell's spot is far from secure, as we saw with the Giants last season. So he's an interesting, deeper guy you can get in a lot of dynasty leagues. In the running back room, Kenneth Gainwell is still ahead of Will Shipley, but I do think that if Barkley goes down, we would see Shipley sooner rather than later. For that reason, I'm not particularly interested in grabbing Gainwell, but I am at least a little bit interested in grabbing Shipley. They obviously rested their tight ends as well, but Dallas Goedert's obviously one of the guys that you want earlier in drafts. AJ Brown and Devonta Smith are obviously fantastic picks, and Saquon Barkley and Jalen Hurts should be starts. Ravens versus the Steelers. The Ravens rested a whole heap of players, so we didn't learn a whole lot here. They've got a heap of players injured as well. Rasheen Ali's been out, so it's unclear whether he's ahead of Owen Wright or not. Kid Mitchell's obviously going to be out going into the season. nothing particularly interesting happening with the wide receivers. You don't even want Nelson Aguilar, so you definitely don't want the backups. Isaiah Likely's been rested a lot. They definitely see a role for him, but I don't really see a situation where you're going to want him in fantasy unless Mark Andrews goes down. So unless you've got a particularly deep bench and you're in a tight end premium league, I don't see any value in having him. For the Falcons, nothing particularly jumped out. Jace McClellan and Carlos Washington are fighting out for that third spot, but they're not guys that you want. I'm a little bit concerned how they're going to use Avery Williams. It is possible they use him on a lot of third and longs again. But realistically, it's not going to have a big impact on Bijan Robinson. We know that Ray McLeod is now the starting slot player. Rondale Moore's out with injury, and Kadarrell Hodge is the backup. He's not someone you're going to want even if he starts. It is really those top three guys. We're expecting a lot of 11 personnel from the Falcons, and I think all three of their pass catchers could be fantastic. Basically, their whole depth chart is basically locked in at the moment. Someone you'll notice is missing from the Ravens depth chart is, in fact, Devontae Walker, who I forgot to mention is well down the depth chart to the point where he didn't even start with three guys rested. Despite being a fourth rounder, I think we hoped for a little bit more from him, but it is what it is. He's not someone that's going to be relevant this year. That doesn't mean you should drop him for Dynasty, but I do think he's someone that you don't need for redraft. For the Texans, they started quite a few of their starters, though Joe Mixon was injured, so we didn't see him. It's clear that Dameon Pierce is the clear backup running back for the Texans. It's a bit surprising because he hasn't been fantastic, but realistically, they don't have a lot behind him. It's possible that Cam Akers keeps rising and takes that role away, but at the moment, Pierce is, I guess, nominally an option for a backup. He is a handcuff that you could get if you're in a deeper league and you have Mixon and you just want to make sure that you have that Texans running back, because I think the Texans could be very good this year, and having their starting running back could potentially be valuable. Just don't know how much you're going to get out of Pierce and what they'll do if we actually see Mixon get injured. With the wide receivers, obviously Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs are the starting guys. Tank Dell's mainly been playing in 11 personnel, which does mean he drops down my rankings a little bit because you're just going to get a whole lot fewer looks when you're not out on the field for 20 or 30% of the snaps. Dalton Schultz also losing an annoying amount of snaps to Brevin Jordan as well. I think we kind of signaled that last week. Jordan was injured, and I kind of thought that potentially it could be someone that impacted Schultz, but I didn't really think it was going to impact him to that extent. They also paid Schultz a whole lot of money, so it's possible this was just a preseason thing, but it's enough just to be a little bit wary of Schultz and not go out of your way to go and get him. Meanwhile, for the Giants, most of their starters started. Obviously, Tyrone Tracy was injured last week. He's the clear backup. Eric Gray came in. We even saw Joshua Kelly pop up, but he's well down the depth chart. For the wide receivers, Malik Neighbors is the very clear number one, and he looks good. He's realistically probably the only guy in this team that you really want to go out of your way to get in fantasy. I was very, very high on him in dynasty drafts. I was a bit nervous about how he'd go this season, but I do think, especially in a PPR league, he's going to get so much volume that there's definitely going to be value there. Wandale Robinson is the slot guy, but he's mainly only playing in 11 personnel. And as I said with Tank Dell, that's not something you particularly want, even though the slot can be valuable for the Giants. You'd also think, well, maybe you want their guy that's going to be on the outside and playing all the time, but it's unclear whether that's Jalen Hyatt or Darius Slayton. I thought because Slayton got rested week one that it might be him, but Hyatt's come in and kind of split snaps with him. So realistically, I don't think you want either of those guys. I think it's basically Neighbors and maybe Singletary that you want from this team, and Daniel Jones and Superflex, and that's it. Even Theo Johnson and Daniel Bellinger, it's not clear what's going on there. It looks like a bit of a committee. So this is a whole ugly situation I don't want to be involved in. I'm just not going to have many Giants on my team at all, and I would recommend the same for you outside Malik Neighbors. Bengals against the Bears. Bengals rested a whole heap of starters. It was Logan Woodside for the vast majority of the game. Chris Evans, unfortunately, out for this whole season. Gosh, that was barely in English. With a serious injury. We didn't see any of the starting wide receivers, but we did see Jermaine Burton starting with the starters in this game next to big names like Shedrick Jackson and Kwame Lassiter too. Obviously, they're guys you obviously had on your bingo card for the coming fantasy season. Look, it's clearly going to be Chase, Higgins, and Joseph. We'll see Irwin a little bit because he's a good blocker and he's just a reliable player. But I do think it's going to be those top three that are going to be starting. Jermaine Burton will make the roster. There's no surprises there. But he's got a lot of work to do to move up higher than maybe wide receiver 5. That's the best he is at the moment. You don't particularly want any of the tight ends. I did think maybe Eric Hall Jr. would get involved a little bit more, but he's been injured. it is possible during the season he starts to take over. They have talked up Mike Gesicki, but I don't know that you can read much into his situation just because he was rested, because so was Drew Sample, and we saw they had a big rotation last season. With the Bears, they started their actual starters, although we didn't see DeAndre Swift, which was very interesting. We hardly saw him in the previous game. He played like 2 snaps, and they weren't even consecutive snaps. It was very strange. So Caleb Williams played plenty. He looked okay, but don't read into the preseason too much. Roshan Johnson's still injured, so we don't really know what's going on with the running backs. Khalil Herbert's clearly the, if Swift goes down, clearly the early down back, assuming Johnson isn't around as well. And then Travis Homer played as the receiving back. I don't know that you can really get much out of that. It's DeAndre Swift that you want here and nobody else. For the wide receivers, obviously DJ Moore and Keenan Allen are the main guys. Allen will be in the slot. Rome Odunze, be interesting to see if he plays in other personnel groupings or if he's just an 11 personnel guy. I do think that they'll eventually start to work him in, especially if he looks good, but he is someone that's a little bit further down for me than Moore and Allen. I don't want any of the backups there. With the tight ends, we're kind of used to Cole Kmet being a very useful player in fantasy, but he and Gerald Everett were clearly in some sort of committee situation last week. Same thing happened here, but they kind of went by drive, where it was Kmet then Everett, but Everett was still in with the starters. So I don't think you can say that Cole Kmet's someone you can really have for fantasy at the moment. He's someone that I'm typically avoiding. Chiefs against the Lions. Interesting close game against a couple of potential playoff contenders this season if they make it to the Super Bowl. Look, you know what to expect from the Chiefs. This has been coming for a while. The only real surprise for the Chiefs, Carson Steele. We expected him to be a fullback. He's listed as a fullback. And after Isaiah Pacheco was out after a touch, all of a sudden it was Carson Steele coming in ahead of Deneric Prince. There was a lot of talk that Prince might take over from Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Suddenly it's the undrafted fullback that's coming in. I have no idea what to make of that, but it means that Prince isn't someone that you can rely on in any league outside a deep dynasty league because he's behind the fullback. It's really strange. It'll be really interesting to see what happens next week because I don't think we have any clarity in this running back room behind Pacheco and maybe Edwards-Helaire. With the wide receivers, obviously Marquise Brown's out. The interesting thing is that Justin Watson came in. I think we kind of expected this might be the case. He started over Sky Moore. Sky Moore came in when Brown went down, but they didn't have Watson available. He was injured. He's back, and he comes in as the guy that's going to start while Brown is out for the first couple of weeks. You don't want him in fantasy. Travis Kelce, obviously the number 1 tight end. You know how good he is. For the Lions, nothing particularly jumping out here. They rested a whole lot of their starters. Interesting, they're still putting Nate Sudfeld ahead of Hendon Hooker. Craig Reynolds is the clear backup, but you still don't want him because if one of those top 2 guys goes down to the other one that's going to be the main winner. For the wide receivers, Donovan Peoples-Jones has moved up a little bit. He's probably the clear backup. We'll also see a bit of Caden Davis. I think those guys would be the guys that battle it out if one of the starters gets injured. But we saw last season, you really don't want anyone but Amon-Ra St. Brown and maybe Jamison Williams. Khalif Raymond's interesting for best ball leagues, and that's probably about it because you don't know what weeks he's going to be good. Vikings against the Browns. Sam Darnold was rested. Don't want to injure your starting quarterback when your backup is out for the season. So it was a whole lot of Nick Mullins. They rested their starting running backs. There's nothing interesting going on behind them. They rested most of their tight ends as well. Munt and Oliver were both out, which tells us that Robin Tunyon is not the guy that you're going to want while Hockenson is injured. At wide receiver, unsurprisingly, Jefferson was rested. Addison was out injured. So it's the number 3 slot that we're most interested in. Now, for me, I still probably think it's going to be Brandon Powell in the slot when they need a slot guy. He has typically been their slot guy in the past. I do think he's probably technically the starter, but he'll only play in 11 personnel. You're not going to find him out wide. It is possible that when Jefferson and Addison moves to the slot, and I think that will happen semi-regularly, it's probably Jalen Naylor that comes in there to take that spot. I don't know how that's going to look, and it is possible that as the season goes on, Naylor just takes over from Powell. So at the moment, you don't want either of them, but if you want a really deep stash, I do think Naylor could be an interesting one for the longer term. Meanwhile, for the Browns, they rested a heap of players. The only thing of particular interest here is that Donta Foreman was playing behind Pierre Strong. There was a lot of talk that he might take some touches away from Jerome Ford. It is still possible he's going to be used on the goal line and only on the goal line, but I think it's equally possible that he's not used at all because he's really not much of a special teams player. And I feel like if they see Strong ahead of him, and then they also get Naheem Hines involved, and he is a special teams player, all of a sudden you've got your 4 running backs. Do you really need Foreman? I don't think you probably do. Very hard to tell what's going on with the wide receivers outside David Bell probably being somewhere in those top 5, and you don't want anyone behind that. Elijah Moore against Cedric Tillman, still a little bit interesting, but I think Tillman gets that starting job. Panthers against the Jets, and I'm not going to bury the lead here. I'm really upset about this game. I was so high on Braylon Allen. I thought he was the clear backup to Brees Hall. I thought everything was going well. He looked fantastic in the preseason. He's a big back. He can be used on the goal line. He's a fantastic receiving back. They get to the second game of the preseason, and Isaiah Davis is starting. They drafted him after him. He's not as good. What are you doing? I don't understand what Robert Saleh's up to here. This is crazy to me. Braylon Allen should be the clear backup here. This makes me very nervous. You don't want someone on your bench who's not going to be really valuable when an injury happens because there's no upside to having them there. And all of a sudden, Braylon Allen, who's one of my favorite upside guys, no longer has that clear path to upside. So I am pissed about this situation. I'll put it that way. You don't want any of these backs behind Brees Hall until we find out exactly what's going on with Braylon Allen. Perhaps this is just a 1 week punishment thing of some sort. I don't know. Maybe they're giving Davis a go. So we'll see what happens in week 3. If it goes back to being clearly Allen, I'm going to be back on that train, but I'm not happy about this situation. They rested a lot of wide receivers. I'm not really sure what's going on with Malik Taylor and Alden Lazard. I couldn't find anywhere that said they're injured, but it seems weird to me that they're so clearly ahead of the others that they weren't used at all. I'm not surprising that Corley was used, but the concern there is he wasn't played in 11 personnel. And for that reason, I find it hard to be particularly high on him. For the Panthers, rested a whole lot of starters as well. 4 running backs, which is crazy. Obviously, Brooks is injured. Heap of wide receivers. We still don't know what's going on with Xavier Leggett and Jonathan Mingo. I do think that possibly to start the season, we might see Mingo first. Realistically, he was an earlier second-round pick last season, so it's not crazy to think he might be ahead of a very, 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 very late first-round pick in Leggett. I prefer Leggett myself, but Mingo could realistically take that starting role, or it could be a shared job. Sanders is obviously the only healthy tight end at the moment, but he wasn't consistently playing on third downs. That's a pretty heavy receiving down for a tight end. And if you're not going to play there, if it's Tommy Tremble, for example, that's a big concern for his value. So I'm not particularly interested in Sanders in redraft, but I do think in Dynasty, he's someone with a lot of upside. He was ahead of Ben Sinnott for me for a lot of the preseason in Dynasty. Cardinals against the Colts. They rest a whole lot of starters, the Cardinals, but where it's interesting is in the running back room. Trey Benson seems like if James Conner is out and even moving on potentially, that he might only be a first and second down back, and that loses a lot of value for him. He is very good on those downs, but you really need a guy who's going to be a 3-down back if they're going to be a good handcuff for you because he's not going to be a starter in week 1. So that's not a great situation for those Trey Benson owners. It looks like he is going to have closer to a redshirt year this year, though it's not quite going to be quite as bad as we talked about and some speculated when we talked about training camp news earlier in the year. Amari Demercado and Michael Carter are fighting it out for that receiving role. That has pretty much no value, but it does seem very clear that they do want someone who's a clear receiving back and going to come in on 2-minute drills. That may help hurt James Conner somewhat. It is possible that when they would have otherwise used him there, they now won't, and that's going to hurt his receiving work, but I do think James Conner is still going to be a high-value guy. What'll be interesting is if the Cardinals end up out of playoff contention, do they keep using Conner? I think probably yes, but it is possible that we start to see a little bit more Trey Benson. Plus, realistically, James Conner gets injured every year anyway. For the wide receivers, Jones and Dortch both injured. It's a little bit unclear who's their third starter there, but clearly it's Marvin Harrison Jr. and Michael Wilson as the 2 main outside guys. Elijah Higgins getting rested is very interesting. He's clearly the number 2 option there. And given how they use Trey McBride, and given Higgins is very much a receiving tight end, maybe he has some value in some deep dynasty leagues. For the Colts, the rest of a whole lot of starters. Tyler Goodson and Evan Hull are in a real battle for that third running back spot. Given Trey Sermon's had some injuries and arguably could be considered to be injured, even though I've got him listed as rested, potentially that role could be valuable. But I do think maybe if Jonathan Taylor goes down, you don't know who the backup is. For that reason, Sermon's the really only backup running back that I'd be interested, even if Sermon's injured. For the wide receivers, Josh Downs is down, so Adonai Mitchell is pretty much locked in. What happens when Downs comes back is the interesting thing. Do we see Pierce starting because Mitchell's been used a lot in the slot? Is it possible that Mitchell takes over from Pierce, given Pierce hasn't been particularly good for a while? He's kind of reliable and a solid blocker, but Mitchell's a really explosive, talented guy. Anthony Gould's kind of the next guy up in the slot, and it is possible he gets some opportunities if Mitchell can take over from Pierce. Might be that we see Gould in the slot. With the tight ends, clearly it's Granson and Mo Alley Cox. They were both rested. And then Andrew Ogletree and Will Mallory played ahead of Jelani Woods. I think a lot of people, including myself, thought maybe Woods is going to be the start of this season. It was certainly trending that way before he got injured, but clearly he just hasn't come back and looks good enough to justify having that spot. Dolphins against the Commanders. A lot of starters playing here. It is notable that Mostert and Achan both started, but that's because Wilson's injured. Jalen Wright, we think, is injured. Salvan Ahmed is injured. So it was really only Mostert, Achan, and Chris Brooks and some random other guys involved. They didn't have anyone else really available to them. So that's why we're seeing a bit of Mostert and Achan. And Mostert is the clear starter here. I'm getting pretty close to ranking Mostert ahead of Achan. That's nowhere near where he's ranked for most people, but he's obviously the starting running back. He scored way more fantasy points last season. I don't know how you can draft Achan so early. I wouldn't be taking him anywhere near the first few rounds. To me, Mostert's the guy with a whole heap of value. For the wide receivers, Odell Beckham Jr. is still injured. Seems like Braxton Berrios is probably going to be the slot guy, but you don't really want any of those guys. Interesting to see the 7th round of Malik Washington moving up the depth chart there, but I do think realistically, if it's not Hill or Waddle, don't worry about the wide receivers. Beckham, you just don't know about his health. Janu Smith is not playing enough downs at the moment to really be considered. I'm a little bit concerned about what that's going to look like. So he was someone I thought might be interesting given his talent, but he's still not playing an every down role. That might develop, but they do like Durham Smythe. So I do think this is probably a committee situation to avoid. For the Commanders, Jen Daniels officially the starter. No one is surprised by that. I think that was always going to happen. Brian Robinson is becoming more clearly the starting running back here, but you're still going to see a whole heap of Austin Eckler, even if it's more so on receiving downs. Jeremy McNichols is the backup ahead of Chris Rodriguez at this stage, which is interesting because I thought Rodriguez looked okay last season. But McNichols has more of a every down skill set. Rodriguez is very much just a runner of the ball. For the wide receivers, it's very interesting. They said earlier this week they're looking for a wide receiver too. Well, they found it. It's Jahan Dodson. He's going to be playing the slot a lot, but it does seem that he's also going to be playing in 11 personnel. He could be really good this year. He's a deep sleeper that I really like and someone I suggest getting into late rounds. Terry McLaurin is not as high on. I do think that they're not going to throw the ball quite as much as many would hope. De'Ami Brown seems to be the number 3, but he is fighting it out with the Olamide Zacchaeus. One of those guys will get that job because it ain't going to be Luke McCaffrey, which a lot of people hoped it would be. He was a 3rd-round pick, very late 3rd-round pick, but it seems like that's not going to happen. So Brown and Zacchaeus are the 2 guys you don't want either for Dynasty, but you also don't want Luke McCaffrey. He's nearly droppable, realistically. He's a 3rd-round pick, so in many Dynasty leagues, you're just going to have to keep him, but I do think in a shallower Dynasty league, I would be dropping him. Zach Ertz is still being rested, and John Bates looking like he's ahead of Ben Sinnott, which is why I was low on Sinnott earlier in the preseason. I do think at some stage Ben Sinnott's going to take over, but it might not be this season. Bills against the Steelers in a weird game with a whole lot of field goals. A lot of players rested for the Bills, but they used their starting running backs. Actually, not that many players rested. Josh Allen was rested, I guess, for the Bills, and they used their starting running backs. James Cook played a lot. He played basically the whole first quarter. Then Ray Davis came in and played a whole quarter. I mean, that's clearly the order. We don't really know how many snaps Davis is going to take off Cook, but Cook is rising for me because they're not even considering using him in any sort of committee situation. Does seem like he'll be the starter. I do think Ray Davis is a danger to him, and I think Ray Davis is still one of the most valuable backups. Because it's not like they're bringing anyone else in to compete with Davis. He is the clear number 2 guy, and we know that you kind of do want the running back in this offense, especially if he's going to play every down. So James Cook could be good this season, but I love Ray Davis as a late-round guy that you can just stash on your bench. For the wide receivers, Keon Coleman is a clear starting outside receiver, and very interestingly, so is Matt Collins. He was starting on the outside a lot of the time. Now, how that works with Khalil Shakir, we don't know. Curtis Samuel was out this game, but Shakir seemed to only be playing in 11 personnel. So it is entirely possible that we see that ultimately when Samuel comes in, it becomes very messy between those 3 players. So I'm kind of easing back on Shakir. I'm definitely easing back on Samuel, who I liked earlier this season. They gave him a reasonable amount of money. Matt Collins is not someone I'm particularly interested in either. Keon Coleman is the only guy that interests me. He's rising towards my top 30 wide receivers. I loved him in Dynasty. He was my number 4 coming into the Dynasty draft season, and I'm still very high on him. I think I finally nailed that one. For the tight ends, Dalton Kincaid played a couple of snaps and he was done. He's going to have a big role this year. I did move him a little bit low because I was scared about Dawson Knox, but I think it is becoming more and more obvious that Kincaid's going to be heavily involved. For the Steelers, Russell Wilson, highly likely to be the starter, but it wouldn't surprise me if we see Justin Fields at some stage during the year. Jalen Warren got an injury, which is obviously a concern. That could have him out for week 1, and that would make Najee Harris very valuable for week 1. But Probably not once Warren comes back again. To be fair, it is the kind of injury for Warren that could linger a little bit. I do think if Warren's out, we will see some Cordarrelle Patterson, but not enough to draft him. For the wide receivers, they did obviously flirt with having Brandon Ayuk in. Still no updates on that. At least at the time of recording. Van Jefferson is their starting outside receiver. He is not going to be used very heavily. It'll be mainly George Pickens with a little bit of Calvin Austin, who's playing from the slot. Unfortunately, no Roman Wilson at the moment. He's still behind Scotty Miller and Quez Watkins, who got a few snaps out of 12 personnel with Russell Wilson, and we're clearly the next guys up. So I do think that Roman Wilson is going to have to take some time, but I do think eventually he's going to end up being a very solid player. For the tight ends, just a little bit too much Darnell Washington and Michael Pruitt for me. I mean, they do run the ball a lot. I do think that Pat Freiermuth still has some upside if they use him properly, but they're just not at the moment. I mean, what do you expect from Arthur Smith? He does dumb stuff. So I'm very nervous about Pat Freiermuth. In fact, the Arthur Smith situation even makes me slightly nervous about George Pickens, just because you never know who is going to use his best players. So Freiermuth, someone's I've very much eased back on this preseason. Titans against the Seahawks. Titans rested a lot of their starters. It's still unclear what's going on with their running back situation. We don't even know who the clear backup is. It's a little bit unclear who this backup quarterback is. Willis started this game ahead of Rudolph. Wide receivers, they've clearly got their top four, and you don't want anyone after that. You don't even want Burks or Boyd particularly. And Hopkins is obviously injured. Okonkwo and Wiley will be their starting tight ends. You don't want those guys either. Really, I'd just be avoiding the Titans for fantasy for the most part. I think Pollard and Spears are okay. 0 RB options in the middle rounds. Hopkins is aging. Calvin Ridley, it's hard to trust him. I'm just avoiding them. For the Seahawks, plenty of guys that you like, plenty of guys rested. In fact, if a player was rested in this game and they're not Pharaoh Brown, you probably want to start them for fantasy. They're all solid players. Obviously, we know Sam Howell's also one of the best backups around the place as well. Their running backs are really clear cut. Walker and Charbonnet will both be busy. Walker will do the early down stuff. Charbonnet will be out there on nearly half the snaps, but they're not going to be very valuable. But he's one of the most valuable backups in the league. He's going to get an every down role if Walker is out. Technically, McIntosh is behind him, but he's very much the backup to the backup. Wide receiver, still not really trusting Jackson Smith-Njigba. I do think DK Metcalf is the guy you want here. And Tyler Lockett, I think, probably has one more solid season in him. And we know that Jake Bobo is a valuable backup if one of those guys goes down. I'm also liking Noah Fant. He's rising up the rankings for me. It's becoming more and more clear that he is the clear number one guy. Chargers against the Rams. All LA battle here. This was a fun one. Justin Herbert obviously rested along with a couple of running backs, but the wide receivers weren't. And I think that is an interesting point. Joshua Palmer played not really the full role you'd expect him to, but he was essentially the full outside wide receiver. Ladd McConkey was the slot guy, which should be the guy you want here. But he only played in 11 personnel for the most part, and that's very scary. So a little bit off Ladd McConkey at the moment. But where it got real wacky was outside, because it's been DJ Chark ahead of Quentin Johnston this game. It was the 7th rounder, Brendan Rice, who started. Seems like there's a real battle going on there for that third spot. I don't understand what's happening there, but I'm just avoiding all of them. Johnston's still someone I want in Dynasty. I do think the talent will show through eventually. But gosh, it's a weird situation, and Rice is like a deep sleeper you can grab in Dynasty if you want to. Tight ends, it's Hurst and Disley. Don't particularly want either of them. Hurst is the better guy for fantasy, but we know how annoying Disley could be when he was with the Seahawks. Stone Smart's kind of gone past Donald Parham, who's been good at times, but he's now clearly not someone you want for fantasy. For the Rams, rested a whole lot of starters as well. They're still battling at running back. What's going on behind the wide receivers is interesting, but not relevant to fantasy. I think Colby Parkinson is the tight end that you want. They rest basically all their starters, the Rams, and you don't learn very much except who the starters were. So we don't know anything about their patterns, so nothing particularly to learn there. Buccaneers versus the Jaguars. So Baker Mayfield was one of many rested. White, Evans, Godwin, Kate Otten. The only interesting one is Payne Durham. He's the only really non-fantasy relevant player who was rested. So that's an interesting one. He's clearly their number 2 tight end. Still a battle between Jalen McMillan and Trey Palmer for the starting outside role, but they played exactly the same amount of snaps. So we don't know who is ahead in that battle. I think it's probably McMillan, given he's the younger player and he's already gotten even with Palmer. But we'll see what happens. Bucky Irving was clearly ahead of Sean Tucker this time, but Chase Edmonds is still injured. So I don't think you can rely on Irving being the clear backup just yet, even though I was very high on him going into the draft and was kind of happy with where he landed, because I do think he's probably going to end up being the clear backup. For the Jaguars, whole heap of rested players as well. But the most interesting thing here for me is that Bigsby is way ahead of Dearness Johnson now. I didn't see this coming, if I'm completely honest. All the reports are very negative, the opposite of last season. So hopefully that means we see the opposite Bigsby this season. I think that would be good for the Jaguars and good for him. So I think he could be someone who's quite valuable as a backup. He's rising up for me. He's nearly my top 50 because I do think he's someone that you want because we've seen how busy Etienne can be. For the wide receivers, they rested Davis. Kirk is injured. Kirk's only been playing in 11 personnel, which is a little bit scary. I do think it's probably Thomas and Davis on the outside. The way they're using Brian Thomas is very positive. I do think he's someone that could be very valuable for fantasy. Nothing particularly interesting there with the others. Cowboys against the Raiders. A couple of things jumped out here. The first one, Rico Dowdle got rested, I believe. I don't think he was injured. Zeke's obviously was rested in the first game. It seemed like potentially Dowdle might lose his spot to Royce Freeman and was battling with Malik Davis, but it seems like Dowdle is who we thought he was going to be, a guy in a committee with Zeke Elliott, and that's really positive for his value. I liked him a lot going into this season. I've got him very cheap in a lot of dynasty leagues. I talked about him a lot. I'm glad that it's kind of heading in that direction, even though we had some doubts briefly. In fact, Royce Freeman is battling it out with Malik Davis at the moment. It was kind of like Davis first drive, Freeman second drive, Juice Vaughn third drive, which is a weird way of doing things. But it seems like they just don't know who the backup is. We'll have to wait and see what happens there. I think Freeman still has a chance of making the roster, but if he's not offering enough in special teams, maybe they go another way. For the wide receivers, Jalen Tolbert playing is a little bit scary. To me, he's still the clear number 3 guy, but those other guys are still getting involved. And Kevontae Turpin was out this game. I don't know that necessarily means he has a role. It's possible he was just injured. I doubt he was rested. Or it is possible they're just like, he's a clear kick returner. He's not doing anything else. So we're just going to rest him because we know what he can do. Either way, I do think Tolbert's still clearly the number 3. I don't know that he has that much value, even though he is a former day 2 pick. Nothing particularly interesting at tight end there. For the Raiders, Gardner Minshew, the official starter. I wouldn't say I saw that coming. I think it made sense, like way back when I had Minshew high, but there's been a lot of Aiden O'Connell buzz. So I'm slightly surprised that Minshew ended up with the nod, but not fully. I think it was probably a reasonable chance that was going to happen. Zamir White is the guy I'm very concerned about, though. He is not getting the sort of touches that would suggest he's going to be an every down running back. We knew it wasn't going to get the receiving work, but he's not even getting all the early down work either. We're seeing a bit too much Alexander Madison. So Madison could be an interesting guy to have who might have a bit more of a role than we expect and also be the clear handcuff because they don't really have another backup early down back behind him. Lauby and Abdullah don't play that role. Be interesting to see if we do see some receiving work out of Abdullah or Lauby if they continue to use Madison in that role. So I think Zamir White is a guy that I'm going to move down quite a lot. Madison moves up a little bit for me, and I don't want either of the receiving backs until we clearly see what's going on. For the wide receivers, Devontae Adams still injured. Trey Tucker will play outside. Myers played in the slot last week, but it was DJ Turner in the slot this week. I do think once Adams comes back, Myers returns to the slot. Christian Wilkinson's dropped behind Turner, but we'll see what happens next week. Brock Bowers has been injured, so Michael Mayer started, but Bowers will obviously be back for the season. Packers against the Broncos. Nothing to see here for the Packers. Literally nothing to see here. They rested all their starters. Nothing interesting happened at all. For the Broncos, Bo Nix played ahead of Jarrett Stidham. We knew that was going to happen if you watched the midweek news with me. Running back is significantly more interesting. Javonte Williams didn't start in the same way he did last time. He kind of moved in and out with Jaleel McLaughlin a lot. McLaughlin got a lot of the passing down work, but Williams got a little bit. Samaje Perine was used as the clear receiving back last week. This week, he was used as kind of like the third guy in quite a bit after Williams and McLaughlin. He kind of moved in and out with Estime. So it is possible that Perine's lost that receiving job and it might go towards McLaughlin. That would really help his value, but realistically, he's still not going to be a starting running back. I do think that you probably don't want anyone but Williams here, and you don't even particularly want Williams. At wide receiver, they made this really obvious. Cortland Sutton and Tim Patrick are the starting outside wide receivers. Josh Reynolds is in the slot. Marvin Mims Jr. is just here to disappoint everyone. And there is going to be no Troy Franklin in the near future because he is well down the depth chart. He's outside that top 7 from what we can tell. He will rise eventually, presumably, but it is very surprising to see him that low down when he was considered one of the better 4th round prospects coming in. A lot of people saying he should have been a 2nd and 3rd rounder. For the tight ends, Greg Dulcich will be the main starting guy, but we're seeing too much Lucas Krull to feel good about him, and Adam Troutman is going to be out there a lot. So I think I'll just be avoiding all Broncos tight ends. Last one, 49ers against Saints. Interesting, we saw Brock Purdy when so many other players were out. We didn't see any of the top 4 running backs because they're all injured. We saw Cody Schrader, who I loved at Iowa. I had him in my college fantasy league, hoping he can at least make the roster. At wide receiver, top 4 all out as well. Jacob Cowan got involved. He's a 4th-round rookie. Not expecting much from him this season, but maybe he's a deep stash for some dynasty leagues. Tight end, obviously, Kittle's the main guy. We still don't know what's going on with Sobert and Willis. We at least see Cameron Latu come back. I do think he'll make the roster and at some stage rise up to that number 2 slot. For the Saints, we saw a whole lot more of the starters. Derek Carr finally started. Alvin Kamara didn't, but I do think that he's going to be very good this season with Derek Carr starting. Spencer Rattler went past Jake Hain, or at least got the opportunity second this week. We'll see what happens in the last week as to who is going to win that job. But Rattler improved his situation certainly this week, even though he didn't play overly well. Jamal Williams still got plenty of touches here. He's the only guy of those 3 running backs that's likely to even be involved. I do think he's more of like just an inconvenience to Kamara, and obviously Kendre Miller's still injured. I do think Kamara's the only running back you want there, unless you include Taysom Hill, who was all over the place again in this game. I do think Taysom Hill is someone that's going to be very interesting. I've moved him up quite a lot. I think he might be tight end 14 for me now or something crazy like that, because he just always ultimately ends up producing. He did a lot of running this game and he didn't even receive any passes. So I do think that we might see that Taysom Hill has another productive season. At wide receiver, it became quite interesting. Rashid Shaheed's injured at the moment. Cedric Wilson we knew was going to be the other starter, but in for Shaheed, they brought Bub Memes in as their 3rd wide receiver. He was injured last week. He's their 5th-round rookie, someone I was quite high on, but then we didn't see much of him, so I assumed he'd dropped down or not had an opportunity. A.T. Perry had a fantastic game last year. He had like 4 for 85 or something like that in his limited time, and suddenly he's dropped down quite a bit. So it's a really weird situation here. I don't know what will happen if Shaheed's actually out, but Means is someone that you can definitely have as a deep stash in Dynasty. Now, you've got leagues coming up and I would like to help. We just went through a whole heap of information. You can still get rankings, but realistically, they might not be right for your league. I would like to help you out by personalized rankings for your specific situation. So please hit me up at benwasley23@gmail.com and I will write rankings that are specific to your league for your scoring settings, for your roster settings, everything exactly as you need it for your league. So check us out. A lot of people have been doing it this season. I've got 6 or 7 sets of rankings I need to create this week. And I'd love to add yours to my list and help you out and help you win your drafts. That's all we've got for today, though. I do hope that you will like and subscribe on YouTube. Check us out on Instagram at The Fantasy First Down. I answer all your questions over there. On Twitter, I'm at Fantasy First Down with no O. Obviously, my rankings are at ffdfantasyfootball.com and my articles are over at football.raspball.com. I'll see you later in the week when we're going to talk about rookie wide receivers and what you can expect this year.